She was shivering in the rain, staring at the sandwich in my hands like it was treasure. And when I gave it to her, she started crying. If you love heartfelt sci-fi stories about compassion, survival, and unlikely bonds, make sure to subscribe, and let's begin. The forest outpost had gone silent months ago. No more shipments, no calms from orbit, no signs of life, just the quiet hum of wind against hollow steel and the endless rustle of pine. Duran had grown used to it, the solitude, the maintenance checks, the recycled meals. It was easier than dealing with the collapse beyond the trees. Then one evening, while carrying his dinner outside to cool, he saw something move near the tree line, a flash of red, a pair of sharp ears and eyes wild, starving, desperate. She crouched low, first slick with rain, hair tangled like fire and shadow. He should have gone back inside, locked the door, ignored it like all the manual said to do. Instead, Duran tore the sandwich in half and offered it out into the rain. The sandwich was cold before she took it. Duran held it out anyway, one hand steady, the other gripping the porch rail in case she bolted. The fox girl's eyes flicked between his face and the bread, nostrils twitching as the scent of protein and spice drifted through the rain. Her tail, muddy, matted, trembled behind her. She looked half feral, half starved, but there was something human in her expression. Hungry, yes, but not the kind that belonged to predators. It was the kind that came from being too alone for too long. When she finally took the sandwich, she didn't run. She crouched right there in the mud, hands shaking, and ate in silence. Duran watched her chew with small, deliberate bites, as if afraid he'd take it back. The rain thickened. He glanced toward the cabin light spilling from the window. Warm, golden, promising, and sighed. "Come on," he said quietly. "You'll freeze out here." She looked up, eyes wide, ears twitching beneath tangled red hair. When he stepped back toward the door, she flinched but didn't run. He left it open. By the time Duran finished drying his hands by the stove, she was standing just inside the threshold, dripping on the floorboards, staring at the flickering light panel like it was sorcery. Her tail brushed the wall, leaving streaks of wet brown fur. He didn't speak, didn't make sudden moves. He just filled another bowl from the pot simmering on the heater and set it on the table. "Soup," he said. "It's edible." She sniffed it cautiously, then dipped her fingers in, tasting the broth like it was something precious. Her voice, when it came, was raw and halting. "You not afraid?" Duran leaned against the counter. "Should I be?" She blinked, then looked down at her claws. "Most are." He shrugged, crossing his arms. "Most aren't here anymore." That night, she slept curled near the stove, tail wrapped around herself, as if the fire was the only thing left she trusted. Duran left her a blanket, but didn't expect her to use it. When he woke the next morning, she was gone. Bowl empty, door cracked open. He figured that was the end of it. 2 days later, he found paw prints by the compost barrel, and a few scraps missing. Then, a faint shadow slipping between trees at dusk. She was still out there. Duran started leaving extra portions near the porch, half a ration pack, a few strips of dried fruit, one of the rare nutrient bars he'd been saving. Each time they vanished overnight. Sometimes he'd find small offerings in return, a smooth stone, piece of broken glass polished by rain, a sprig of flowers left on the steps. He wasn't sure if it was thanks or habit, but the gesture, quiet, deliberate, felt like language. When the power grid flickered one evening, he was outside adjusting the relay when something moved near the tree line again. Only this time, she didn't hide. She stepped out of the shadows, barefoot in the frost, holding one of his lost gloves. Her ears drooped, her tail brushed low against the snow. "You dropped," she murmured, voice softer now. Duran took it from her with a small nod. "Thanks." She tilted her head, studying him. Then, with the faintest smile, she added, "You cook again?" That night, she came inside without invitation. She sat at the table, watching as he stirred noodles and powdered broth together. Her nose twitched, her ears angled forward. "You're Vexa, right?" he asked suddenly. She froze, chopsticks halfway to her mouth. "How you know?" "You carved it," Duran said, pointing to the wooden porch beam where faint letters, awkward, uneven, spelled her name. Her cheeks flushed beneath the flicker of firelight. "Practice," she whispered. "Looks good," he said simply. As days turned to weeks, Vexa became a fixture in his small world. She fixed broken floorboards with surprising precision, gathered wild herbs from the forest, and after a few lessons, learned to patch clothes on his old repair bench. The cabin, once silent, began to sound alive again. There were little noises now, the soft tap of claws on floorboards, quiet humming when she cleaned, the rustle of her tail brushing past furniture. Winter deepened, and Duran realized how much the air changed when she smiled. The storms outside grew harsher, the generator weaker, and the food stores thinner. The environment was their shared enemy. Cold hunger time? Yet somehow every challenge was softened by her presence. When snow piled against the door one night, and the wind howled like an animal, Duran found her standing by the window, ears flicking, watching the white void outside. "Storm will last a few days," he said. "A well ration." She looked back at him, tail twitching. "You mean share?" He smirked. "That's one way to put it." Vexa stepped closer, wrapping her arms around herself. The flicker of the fire painted her eyes amber. "You feed me once," she said quietly. "And now I stay." Duran's voice softened. "Guess I'll have to get used to it." The wind roared. The cabin creaked, and inside, between two souls from different worlds, warmth finally won against the cold. Snow kept falling for 3 days. By the second morning, the drifts were up to the windowsills and the solar panels had vanished under white. Duran spent most of his time hunched over the heater's regulator, muttering at the pressure gauge, while Vexa followed him like a shadow, curiosity lighting her eyes at every click of a wrench. "You talk to machines," she said finally, tail curling behind her. "I talk at them," he corrected. "They ignore me like everyone else." Her ears flicked in amusement. "Maybe they like you." "They still work." He smirked at that, couldn't help it. She noticed, and her tail swished once, pleased. Their days fell into a rhythm. Morning meant clearing the porch and checking the generator vents. Midday meant cooking whatever mix of dried goods and scavenged herbs they could make taste like food. Evenings they'd sit near the fire, her tail curled around her legs, him sketching repair diagrams on old scraps of paper. Vexa was endlessly fascinated by human tools. She'd pick up a screwdriver and hold it like a pen, studying its weight and balance. Once she tried to tighten a screw with her claws. It went pearly. "Not like that," Duran said, hiding a grin as she scowled at the strip screw head. "Your tools are strange," she huffed. "Tiny metal sticks that bite back. That's one way to describe them." She leaned closer, watching as he demonstrated. Her hair brushed his arm soft, faintly warm, smelling faintly of smoke and rain. She didn't seem to notice, but Duran's hands slowed, heart stumbling once before he caught himself. When the lights flickered overhead, she tensed instinctively, pressing closer to him. The power wavered but steadied again. Duran didn't move. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice came small. "Hate the dark. Reminds me of the old tunnels." "Old tunnels?" She hesitated, eyes drifting toward the fire. "Before I ran, we lived underground. Safer there until it wasn't." He didn't ask for more. The way her voice tightened around those words said enough. The next morning, he woke to the smell of something cooking. Bieksa was crouched by the stove, poking at a pot with exaggerated concentration. "What are you?" "Wait, is that tea?" She turned proud. Found leaves outside near the slope. "Good smell." He frowned. "Could be toxic." She sipped it before he could stop her, ears perking as she smiled. "Not toxic." Duran sighed, resigned. "Guess I'll have some too then." It was terrible. Bitter and metallic. "But she looked so expectant." He forced a nod. "Not bad." Her grin widened. "You lie." He choked on a laugh, nearly spilling the mug. "Yeah, I lie." After that, she began experimenting. Tiny, clumsy attempts to help him survive better. She repaired the cracked window seal with woven bark fibers. She hung herbs above the stove to dry. She even managed to catch a fish from the frozen creek, using nothing but a sharpened stick and terrifying persistence. The night she returned, soaked to the knees and holding the fish triumphantly, Duran was speechless. "You're insane," he said. "Hungry," she corrected, "and learning." He couldn't argue with that. There were small moments that surprised him more than the big ones. The way she'd hum softly while cleaning. The way she tilted her head when trying to understand human idioms. Once she caught him staring at her tail as it waved lazily by the firelight. "You want to touch it?" she asked bluntly. He nearly dropped his mug. "What?" "No, I was just..." Her grin was sharp and amused. "You turned red easy, Duran. Because some of us still have blood pressure," he muttered, earning a quiet laugh that sounded like wind chimes. That night, while the storm rattled the roof, Vexa curled up near the fire as usual. But before he could retreat to his bunk, she looked over her shoulder. "Too cold there," she said simply, nodding toward the darker corner of the room. "You stay here, closer to warmth." He hesitated only a second before sitting down opposite her. They shared the silence between the crackles of fire, the kind that said more than words ever could. By the time the storm broke, their world had shrunk to the cabin and its clearing, two souls against the wilderness. The first sunlight in weeks bled through the snow, painting everything gold. Vexa stood on the porch, tail high, blinking at the brightness. "It's like the world remembers us," she murmured. Duran leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "Maybe it does." She looked back at him, smiling faintly. "You feed me once," she said, echoing her old line. "And now we survive." He chuckled under his breath. "I think that's fair trade." The cold would come again, and the generator would fail, sooner or later. But in that fragile moment, it didn't matter. The silence between storms had become something worth keeping. The thaw came slow, reluctant. One morning, Duran woke to dripping, soft, steady, rhythmic. Meltwater ran down the cabin's eaves like the forest was finally exhaling. The air still bit at his lungs, but the light had changed. It was no longer the pale white of winter. It had warmth to it. Vexa was already outside, barefoot in the slush, staring up at the trees. Drops clung to her red hair, catching the sunlight like scattered embers. Her ears flicked every few seconds, catching each sound. Melt, wind, creek, birdsong. "Spring," she said, smiling faintly. "The world wakes up." Duran leaned against the doorframe, pulling his coat tighter. "You'll freeze out there." She grinned over her shoulder. "Not yet. I like the cold. It's honest." He shook his head, half amused, half bewildered. "You and your philosophy." "Is that a food?" she asked deadpan. He laughed, really laughed. And for a moment, the forest didn't feel empty anymore. The thaw brought new problems. The path to the creek turned into a sucking mire. The cabin roof started dripping in two places, one right over Duran's bunk. He spent the better part of a day trying to patch it while Vexa fetched tools and occasionally shouted advice that made no sense. Maybe sing to it, she suggested as he balanced on the rafters. Yeah, I'll put that right under duct tape on the repair checklist, he called down. It likes your voice, she said innocently. The rafter gave a loud creak. Duran swore, flailed for balance, and landed in a heap on the floor beside her. When he groaned, she tilted her head. You sing now? He stared at her, dust-covered, and then started laughing again. It was easier to laugh around her. Over the next few weeks, they worked like partners. Vexa handled the forest, the traps, the herbs, the small foraging routes. Duran kept the cabin alive, coaxing electricity from aging solar cells and patching worn systems. They'd meet at dusk, both tired, both content. He'd cook something. She'd critique it. Too salty, too dry, too human. And they'd end the night by the fire. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something older, quieter, the comfort of shared purpose. One afternoon, he caught her studying the wall where he pinned his old mission patch, a faded insignia from before the colony's collapse. She traced the embroidered planet with one claw. You came here to build, she said softly. He nodded and ended up fixing what's left. You stay when others run. Someone had to keep the lights on. Her ears drooped. Vulpine run, too. We say it's survival, but sometimes, she hesitated, eyes flicking up to meet his. Sometimes it's just fear. Duran didn't reply. He just reached over and offered her a cup of tea. The better batch she'd made after countless experiments. She took it, smiling in quiet thanks. When the river finally thawed, they ventured out together for supplies. The path was still muddy, but the forest felt alive again. Mist rising from melting snow, birds calling like gossiping neighbors. Vexa carried a small pack and hummed under her breath. Every few steps, she'd stop to crouch, touching a sprout or paw print or rock with reverent curiosity. You ever lived outside the woods? Duran asked. She shook her head. Always trees, always wind. City smells too sharp. Feels like you can't breathe. I used to think the opposite out here. It's too quiet, too big. You got used to it. He smiled sideways at her, maybe because of a certain fox who won't leave my side. Her tail flicked once, embarrassed, but pleased. You gave food, she said softly. That means you're mine now. Is that a fox custom or a threat? Both, she said, completely straight-faced. He chuckled, shaking his head. The trip to the old supply shed took most of the day. The roof had partially caved in, and snow melt dripped through the beams. Inside, they found what Duran had hoped for. Intact ration crates, sealed nutrient packs, and a few old batteries. While he cataloged supplies, Vexa knelt by a broken window, staring out. Feels wrong, she murmured. All these things waiting for no one. They were meant for the next team, Duran said quietly. Guess we're at now. She looked back at him, tail twitching. Then we used them. Well, when they returned to the cabin, the sun was low and gold, spilling through the trees. They stopped just before the porch. Vexa, Duran said suddenly, you don't have to stay here forever. Once the relay is fixed, you could travel. Find your people again. She studied him for a long moment, ears flicking. You think I want to leave? I think you deserve a choice. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I already chose. And with that, she stepped past him into the cabin, tail brushing his leg like a promise. That night, Duran couldn't sleep. The forest was loud again, alive, shifting, whispering. And he realized he wasn't listening for danger anymore. He was listening for her voice, her laugh, her soft steps near the stove. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was a heartbeat, quiet but steady, and for the first time in years, Duran didn't feel like the last human on the planet. By the time the first wildflowers pushed through the wet soil, the forest had changed completely. The harsh wind of winter was gone, replaced by the constant hum of insects and the slow drip of meltwater trickling into the creeks. It was a living sound, steady breathing, almost peaceful. Duran had stopped marking days on the wall. They didn't matter much anymore. The seasons measured time better than numbers ever could. Most mornings began the same. He'd wake to faint sunlight through the half-fixed window and the quiet shuffle of Vexa moving around the cabin. She liked mornings. Something about the way lights spilled across the floor made her tail flick lazily. Content. She'd hum as she swept dust into the corner, careful not to disturb the collection of small items she'd started keeping. Smooth stones, old gears, feathers, scraps of wire. She found interesting. He'd tease her for being a magpie. She'd reply that humans were the same. They just built bigger nests. The thaw brought small luxuries. With the snow gone, the creek ran clean again. They could wash clothes in the shallows, though Duran always ended up wetter than necessary. Vexa laughed every time, calling him. The splash humid and splattering him back until he gave up. Their laughter carried through the trees, startling birds and echoing against the hills. It was strange how easy that sound came now. How natural it felt to have someone to share it with. In the afternoons, they'd fix whatever winter had broken. The greenhouse panels, the cracked piping, the warp door hinge that refused to stay shut. Vexa had gotten better with tools, still preferred claws, but she was learning the patience of mechanical work. You're a terrible student, he muttered as she stripped another bolt. She'd grin. You're a terrible teacher. They'd both end up laughing again. But not every day was easy. When the first spring hit, it came without warning. Gray sky rolling fast, thunder like distant machinery. The cabin shook under the wind. Joanne ran outside to secure the antenna cables, and Bexa followed, clutching the rope in her teeth. As rain turned the ground to mud, lightning flashed close enough to feel, and for a heartbeat, she froze. Ears flat, eyes wide. Joanne dropped the cable, grabbed her wrists, and pulled her back toward the door. Inside, dripping and breathless, they sat by the fire until the shaking stopped. She wouldn't meet his eyes. You okay? He asked softly. She nodded. Hate storms? He handed her a towel, waiting. When I was small, she said finally, voice quiet, storms meant the shelters flooded. I lost. She stopped herself, shaking her head. Never mind. He didn't press her. He just handed her the mug of tea she'd once taught him to make. Storm's passing, he said. You're safe here. After a long silence, she whispered. I know. When she smiled, it was small but real. The forest came alive again the next day, rinsed clean by rain. Joanne repaired the soaked antenna and managed to bring the comms array back online partially. Static filled the airwaves. No human voices. Only faint signals from distant weather drones that hadn't realized their creators were gone. Vexa listened to the noise with fascination. It sounds like ghosts, she said. Just machines, talking to each other? Maybe that's what ghosts are, she said thoughtfully. Echoes that refused to fade. He stared at her, then chuckled. You're wasted on the wilderness. Wasted? Means you should have been a philosopher. She grinned. Still sounds like food. Summer crept in quietly. The days grew longer, the cabin warmer. Vexa began sleeping less by the fire and more by the window, where moonlight painted her hair silver. One evening, Joanne found her outside, sitting on the porch rail with her legs swinging idly. She was watching the stars blink to life above the treetops. Back on Earth, he said, stepping beside her. My father used to tell me every light up there was another home. She tilted her head, ears twitching. And now I think they're reminders, he said. The things we lost, people we didn't save. Vexa leaned her shoulder lightly against his. Maybe also things we still can find. Her words lingered longer than the silence that followed. That night he dreamed of the colony's collapse again. Sirens, orders, the evacuation ships leaving him behind. But when he woke, heart pounding, there was warmth beside him. Vexa had fallen asleep curled at the foot of his bed, tail draped over his boots. She stirred when he moved, blinking groggy. Bad dream? She murmured. He nodded. Without a word, she reached out and touched his wrist. Just a small grounding gesture. Her fingers were warm, steady. Then dream here, she said softly. It's quieter. He didn't know if she meant the cabin, the forest, or her presence. But it didn't matter. He lay back down, and for the first time in years, sleep came easy. By midsummer, the forest was in full bloom, and their small world had settled into something that felt almost permanent. The enemy now wasn't hunger or cold. It was the quiet thought that someday the world might change again, might pull them apart. But as long as the river ran and the fire still burned, either of them spoke that fear aloud. Because for now they had each other, two survivors of different worlds, finding peace in the small, stubborn act of living. The summer ended, not with storms, but with silence. The rain stopped 1 week in July and simply didn't return. The creek shrank to a trickle. The air turned sharp and dusty, and the forest floor crackled underfoot. The leaves curled in on themselves as if holding their breath. Joanne checked the reservoir every morning, watching the numbers drop a little more each day. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but the air carried that brittle stillness that told him they were close to running dry. He rationed what he could. 1 bath every few days, tighter recycling cycles on the purifier, fewer cooking pots to clean. Vexa didn't complain. She adapted quickly, fetching water before dawn when the mist still clung to the trees, carrying the pails balanced across her shoulders. You shouldn't do all that, he said one morning as she came back glistening with sweat. I like the walk, she said simply. And you hate mornings? She wasn't wrong. By the second week, the plants in the greenhouse had wilted. The tomatoes hung small and hard on the vine. The air inside was hot enough to sting. Joanne tried rigging a misting system from scavenged tubing, but the pump sputtered and coughed halfway through. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, running a hand through his hair, and felt the weight of it all. The forest wasn't their enemy. Not really. It was indifferent. It gave life, and it took it away with the same calm rhythm. Vex knelt beside him, tail brushing his knee. You're thinking loud again, he managed to smile. That obvious? You make a face when you worry. What face? Like you bit something sour. He huffed a laugh, the tension breaking for a moment. Guess I do that a lot lately. She studied the brittle leaves around them, then touched one gently. Maybe we rest them. Let them sleep. Things come back after sleep. That's not how irrigation works, he said, but his tone was fond. Maybe not for humans, she said. But the forest does it every year. When the last of the creek pools dried up, they began walking further for water. An hour east to a hollow where meltwater collected in the shade of a cliff. The path was rough, but it became a ritual. 2 pails, a slow climb, shared silence broken only by their breathing. One afternoon, heat shimmered off the stones like invisible fire. Halfway back, Vexa stumbled. Duran dropped the pails and caught her by the shoulders. "Hey, sit down. You're overheating." "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin. He made her drink from his canteen. Her ears drooped, and she didn't argue again. When they finally reached the cabin, she collapsed onto the porch, tail limp. Duran crouched beside her, running a damp cloth across her forehead. "You're supposed to be tougher than this," he said quietly. Her eyes flickered open. "Tough? Not stone?" She tried to grin, but couldn't quite manage it. That night, he stayed up by the fire, checking the water levels again and again. The cabin creaked, wood shifting in the dry heat. Every now and then, he glanced at her sleeping form on the couch, chest rising shallowly. She looked smaller somehow, the wildness tamed by exhaustion. He realized then how easily solitude could return, how thin the line was between peace and loss. The next morning, he woke to the sound of movement outside. Vexa was gone from the couch. Panic hit like a wave. But before he could shout her name, she appeared from the tree-iron carrying a bundle of thick green leaves. She dropped them on the table, smiling weakly. "Found moisture vines," she said. "They drink air." He blinked. "You went foraging now?" She shrugged. "You do the same." He couldn't argue. They boiled the leaves in a pot, condensed the steam against a sheet of metal, and caught the drips in a bowl. The yield was tiny, but it was something. For the next few days, they repeated the process, adding drops of water to their stores, a slow defiance against the drought. Then came the dust. Wind swept through the valley, carrying grit that got into everything, the circuits, their lungs, the small cracks between boards. They sealed the windows as best they could, living in a dim orange haze. Duran's throat burned constantly. Vexa coughed until her voice went hoarse sorrow. Still, she refused to rest. "If we stop moving, the world swallows us." She rasped one night. He sat beside her on the floor, handing her a mug of boiled water. "If we stop moving, the world still turns. We're allowed to rest, Vexa." She took the mug, sipping slowly, eyes heavy. "You rest, then. I'll watch." But when he woke hours later, she was asleep beside him, hands still clutching the empty cup. The drought finally broke in the early hours of morning. It started with wind, cool, damp, unfamiliar, and then came the sound they'd almost forgotten, rain. It began softly, then built until it roared against the roof. Duran stepped outside barefoot, letting it soak him through. Vexa followed, blinking up at the sky as if she didn't believe it. "It came back," she whispered. He smiled. "Told you it would." She laughed, a sound full of relief and disbelief, spinning once in the downpour. Her tail whipped through the air, sending water everywhere. When she looked at him again, her smile was wide and unguarded. "Maybe," she said. "The world remembers kindness, too." And as the rain poured down, washing away weeks of dust and worry, Duran thought maybe she was right. The drought broke, but the rain didn't stop. For days it poured like the sky had something to prove. The soil couldn't drink fast enough. Puddles turned into ponds, and ponds into streams that tore down the valley. The creek behind the cabin swelled until it reached the back fence, brown and angry, carrying branches and debris. At first, Duran and Vexa celebrated the change. They filled every container, every pot, every old ration crate. They laughed when thunder rolled and lightning flashed, letting the water splash across their faces. But by the fourth day, the celebration had turned to quiet worry. The ground around the foundation had gone soft, and the lowest storage shed was half flooded. We could move the crates inside," Vexa suggested, peering through the sheets of rain. Duran shook his head. "Too heavy. We need to wait for the water to drop." "It won't," she said simply, tail twitching. "Not yet." He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Then we move what we can." The next hours blurred into a rhythm of work and wet. They slashed through knee-deep water, lifting what supplies they could to higher ground. Mud sucked at their boots, and the rain was cold enough to sting. By evening, they'd saved the generator core and most of the food packs, but they were both shivering. Duran leaned against the doorframe, dripping, watching the river of rain run past the porch. "Remind me why we didn't just live somewhere normal." "Because you like broken things," Vexa said, wringing out her hair. He barked a short laugh. "Can't deny that." She smiled faintly, but her eyes flicked to the window where lightning glowed across the horizon. "It's angry tonight. It's just weather," he said. She tilted her head, voice soft. "You call it that? We used to call it the world's mood." He considered that as thunder rolled deep and patient. "Then I guess it's in a bad one." By the sixth day, the floodwater crept to the porch. The creek had become a lake, swallowing trees and paths alike. The cabin stood on the small rise of land that remained, an island of wood and flickering light. They barely slept, taking turns checking for leaks. The noise was constant, the kind that filled every thought. Late one night, as Duran patched another board near the baseboards, Vexa brought him a cup of warm broth. Her fur was still damp, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You should rest," he said, taking the cup. "So should you." "Yeah, but I'm stubborn." She smiled faintly. "I noticed." He sat back, sipping slowly. The warmth was thin, but welcome. When he looked at her, she was staring at the window again. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She hesitated. that everything changes. Every season, every storm. But this place, her tail brushed the floor lightly. It feels like it wants to stay. He followed her gaze to the window. The storm-blurred forest, the reflection of the fire behind them. Maybe that's just us wanting it to stay. Vexa didn't answer, but she leaned her shoulder against his silent agreement in the gesture. The next morning, the rain turned colder. The temperature dropped so quickly that their breath fogged indoors. Joran fired up the secondary heater, but the damp made it hiss and spark. The air smelled faintly of burned dust and ozone. Backup plan? Vexa asked. Firewood? He said grimly. They spent the day hauling soggy logs from the shed, breaking them down near the stove, stacking them in clumsy pyramids to dry. It wasn't much, but it was something to do, something that kept them warm through motion. When night fell, the storm showed no sign of easing. The cabin creaked like a ship at sea. The water was only inches from the door. Vexa crouched by the threshold, tail flicking nervously. If it rises more, it won't breach tonight, Joran said. I reinforced the steps. Her ears flicked toward him. You always say that, and I'm usually right. She smiled faintly. Usually they slept in shifts. During his watch, Joran listened to the storm's rhythm, wind, water, wood, until it almost felt alive, like a great beast breathing around them. He thought about how easy it would be for one mistake, one flood surge to erase everything they'd built. And yet, despite the worry, gnawing at his gut, he couldn't bring himself to regret staying. He looked over at Vexa, curled up near the hearth, her tail tucked close for warmth. The light painted her hair gold, her ears flicking even in sleep. She looked peaceful in a way he hadn't seen since she first arrived. Like the storm outside had nothing to do with the calm between them. Something tightened in his chest. Not fear exactly, but realization. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was home. When morning came, the rain had slowed to a mist. The floodwater was still high, but the worst had passed. The sun broke quickly through the clouds, shimmering across the endless pools that reflected the trees like mirrors. They stepped outside together, boots squatching in the wet earth. The air smelled clean, fresh, alive. Vexa breathed it in deeply, then smiled. See, the world's mood changed. Guess it forgave us. She laughed quietly, the sound soft but bright in the morning light. Joran reached down and took her hand without thinking, mud-stained, calloused, trembling slightly from the cold. She didn't pull away. Together, they stood on the soaked porch, watching the water begin its slow retreat, knowing the fight wasn't over, but neither was the peace they'd found. For now, they'd outlasted another season. And, in this small, stubborn corner of the world, that was victory enough. When the floods finally retreated, they left behind more than water. The air was thick with damp rot, the kind that crept into wood and lungs alike. The ground, once clean from the rain, now wryer of decay. Pockets of stagnant water shimmered with oil-slick colors where sunlight hit them. At first, Joran thought the worst was over. The sky cleared, the creek returned to a steady flow, and the forest glowed with impossible green. But the calm was deceptive. The humidity built day by day, and soon every breath felt heavy. And that was when Vexa started coughing. It began as a small sound, barely there, a dry rasp between words. Then it grew worse. Her throat reaned, her voice cracked, and by the end of the week, she couldn't keep food down. Joran knew what it was, the spores. They bloomed in the flooded soil each year, a hazard the colony once controlled with drones and filters. Now it was just them. He set up a makeshift filter in the cabin's vent, rigging scavenged mesh from the old greenhouse. The air cleared a little, but Vex's fever didn't. She slept fitfully, muttering in a half-language that sounded older than either of them. Sometimes she called out names he didn't know. Once she whispered his. Joran stayed awake beside her, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. The old medkit had antibiotics, but only a few doses leftovers from when medical resupply wasn't a fairy tale. He gave her one and hoped it was enough. Hey, he said softly as her eyes fluttered open. You with me? She blinked unfocused. You worry too much? Yeah, he murmured, wringing out the cloth. It's one of my hobbies. Her tail twitched weakly, the movement more memory than strength. Bad hobby. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Can't argue with that. The days blurred. He kept the fire going constantly to drive off the damp, fed her small spoonfuls of broth when she was awake, and scavenged herbs from near the creek when she wasn't. He barely slept. Once he stepped outside to refill the water jug and realized how quiet everything had become. The forest, usually full of chatter and hum, was silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He wondered just for a moment if this was how it all ended, not with violence, but with stillness, a slow surrender. When he returned inside, Vexa was awake again, her eyes clearer but tired. You look worse than me, she raised. I'm fine. You lie bad. He huffed a tired laugh. Yeah, well, I'm out of practice. She reached out, fingers brushing his wrist. Sit, he did. She leaned her forehead against his arm, her skin hot but grounding. You keep saving everything, she whispered. The cabin, the power, me, but you never save yourself. Joran stared at the fire. Maybe I don't need saving. You do, she said simply. Everyone does. That night, the fever broke. Sweat drenched her hair and her breathing came easier. He stayed up through the dawn, just listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The relief hit him like exhaustion. When morning came, she stirred, blinking at him through tangled hair. "Still here?" she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Told you'd be fine." Her voice was but teasing. "You talk like I almost died." "You almost did," he said quietly. Silence stretched between them, fragile as glass. Then she reached up and touched his face, her hand still warm from fever. "You wouldn't let me." He took her hand gently, pressing it against his cheek. "Not a chance." For the next few days, the cabin turned soft again. Quiet, slow healing. Duran slept more than he had in months, usually waking to find Vexa already moving around, weak but smiling. She tried to thank him in her own way, fixing the fire grate, cooking her version of soup, which tasted like spicy river mud, and keeping him out of his tools long enough to rest. "You should eat more," she scolded, pointing a wooden spoon at him. "You cooked it," he said. "That's dangerous." She puffed out her cheeks in mock offense. "You survive storms, but fear soup. Soup has killed better men." Her laughter came light and bright, the kind that melted weeks of tension away. As her strength returned, they stepped outside together. The air had changed again, cooler now, clearer. The forest, once sick with flood and spores, had begun to heal. Moss climbed back over fallen logs. Insects hummed lazily in the shade, and the sound of running water came bright from the creek. Vexa crouched by the edge, dipping her hand into the flow. "Cold again," she said, smiling faintly. "Means the system's resetting," Duran replied. "Seasons turning back." She nodded, then looked up at him. "We did it," he arched a brow. "You mean survived? She said, standing and stayed. He met her gaze, soft and unguarded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we stayed." The wind moved through the trees above them, carrying the scent of rain and new growth. It felt like a promise, a reminder that the world, for all its cruelty, still had room for life to begin again. That night, as they sat by the fire, Vexa stretched out her legs and sighed contentedly. "Maybe," she said, "the world wasn't angry after all." Duran glanced up. "No," she shook her head. "Maybe it just wanted to see if we'd take care of it or each other." He smiled at that. Tired, genuine, full of something quiet and hopeful. "Guess we passed the test then." Vex's tail brushed against his knee, light and slow. "Maybe we just started." Outside, the creek whispered through the dark, steady and alive. The fever had passed, but something stronger had replaced it. A sense of belonging either of them could name. And in that fragile, flickering light, two survivors sat together, not as strangers or rescuer and rescued, but as something simpler. The last two hearts still stubborn enough to believe this world was worth saving. Autumn crept in quietly, painting the forest in slow amber fire. The air turned crisp, and mornings came wrapped in mist that clung to the trees before the sun chased it away. Duran found himself waking earlier now, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The light through the window had become something worth catching. The cabin had changed in small ways. Vexa hung dried herbs over the hearth, filling the air with a soft, earthy scent. A rack of tools stood by the door, his hammer beside her handmade fishing spear. They had a rhythm now. He handled the repairs. She handled the forest. Meals were shared without needing words. The silences between them no longer felt empty. Sometimes Duran would watch her move through the morning haze outside, tail swaying in slow arcs, hair glowing in gold light as she checked the traps or gathered firewood. It hit him how easily she belonged here, like the forest itself had grown a soul and decided to stay by his side. He didn't say it out loud, of course. He just made her tea and pretended not to notice how her ears twitched in thanks when she smelled it brewing. One afternoon they hiked to the ridge behind the cabin. The last of the summer warmth lingered, but the leaves had already started to fall. From the top, they could see miles of wilderness, rolling green, turning to copper, the river glinting like a blade through the valley. Vexa stood still for a long time, wind catching her hair. "It's bigger than I remember," she said softly. "You mean the forest?" She nodded. "I used to think it hated us. Took back everything we built. But maybe it just wanted quiet." He leaned on his knees, looking down at the small clearing where their cabin stood. A tiny speck of order against the endless wild. "Can't blame it. I've wanted quiet too." She smiled over her shoulder. "You found it." He almost said we. The word caught somewhere behind his teeth. They spent the afternoon there eating from a small pack, trading bits of memory like old coins. Vexa told him about her mother teaching her to listen to trees, to feel wind patterns, to sense when a storm was near. He told her about his first off-world job fixing colony pumps that never quite worked the same way twice. By the time they climbed down, the sun had dipped below the ridge, painting everything in deep amber and violet. She walked close beside him, steps matching his without thought. The first frost came early that year. It wasn't harsh, just enough to remind them how thin the walls really were. Duran repaired the heater again, this time with Vex's help. She was quicker now, her claws surprisingly nimble with delicate parts. "You're learning," he said, half impressed, half teasing. "Maybe I teach you next time," she replied, grinning. "Fox methods." "Oh, I'm sure that involves a lot of chewing on wires." She tapped his shoulder with a smirk and maybe biting the human when he's smug. He laughed, ducking away. The sound echoed through the small room like warmth itself. That night, as the temperature dropped, Vexa moved closer to the fire. Joranne handed her a blanket, but she pushed it back gently and patted the spot beside her. "It's warmer when you sit here," she said simply. He hesitated only a moment before sitting. The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was soft, lived in. The crackle of wood, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks, her tail brushing lightly against his leg as if testing permission. After a while, she spoke. "Do you think others made it out there?" "Maybe," he said, "somewhere. And if they came here," he smiled faintly, "then we'd offer them lunch." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes reflecting the firelight. "And maybe they'd never leave." "Seems to be a pattern," he said, voice low. Her tail flicked once. "Then maybe it's a good one." Days slipped into weeks. The frost deepened and the forest grew quiet again. Each morning they'd wake to thin layers of ice on the windows and breathe clouds of mist into the cold air. Yet the cabin stayed alive, smoke curling from the chimney, laughter flickering from within. Vexa started keeping a small journal, pages filled with sketches of plants and tiny notes in a mix of languages. Joranne teased her about it until she drew his portrait with exaggerated eyebrows. He pinned it to the wall. Anyway, their world had narrowed to one clearing, one cabin, one shared rhythm, but somehow that smallness felt infinite. One evening, while the fire burned low, Joranne sat with his feet stretched toward the warmth. Vexa was curled in the armchair beside him, tail draped lazily over the side. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow, steady flakes that melted on the window glass. He watched her for a while, not realizing she was watching him back. "What?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just thinking how strange it is." "What is?" He looked around at the walls, the tools, the flickering shadows, all this. "I thought I came here to escape everything, but it feels like I built something instead." Vexa smiled softly. "You didn't build it alone." He met her eyes. "No, I didn't." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind that said everything else could wait. Outside, the snow kept falling, wrapping the world in white. Inside, two souls who had outlasted droughts and floods and fever sat side by side, not as survivors anymore, but as keepers of something quiet and precious. Their small world had endured, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a fight. The second winter arrived without ceremony. No raging blizzard, no sudden freeze, just a slow tightening of the air, a gentler kind of silence that settled over everything like an old blanket. The trees stood bare and solemn, and the forest floor turned to pale frost, crunching underfoot whenever they ventured out. Joranne had grown used to the sound. It was one of those small comforts now. The rhythm of boots against snow, the echo of Vex's lighter steps just behind his. She hummed sometimes as they walked to the creek to break ice for water. He didn't always recognize the tune, but it was enough to make the cold feel softer. Their world had grown quieter again, but it wasn't lonely anymore. The walls of the cabin held more warmth now than the heaters ever could. Every piece of it bore traces of them. The patched window she'd repaired with resin and bark. The coat hook she carved from driftwood. The faint scuff marks on the floor where they'd argued over how to arrange the table. It wasn't perfect. The world outside still tried to test them. Storms that shook the roof, pipes that froze, nights when the wind screamed through the eaves. But they met it all together. Joranne no longer thought of the wilderness as something to survive. It had become something to share. One morning, the sun rose clear after a long storm. Light poured through the frosted glass, scattering tiny sparks across the floor. Joranne woke to the smell of something cooking. He blinked, disoriented for a moment. The scent was familiar, but not quite right. Vexa stood by the stove, tail swaying lazily as she stirred something in a pan. Steam rose around her, softening her outline. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's that smell?" "Experiment," she said proudly. "I found flour. Old, but not bad. Made flat things." "Flat things?" he repeated. She nodded, flipping one onto a plate. It was somewhere between a pancake and a small piece of rubber. He raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's edible?" "Not sure," she admitted. "You try." Joranne stared at the plate, then at her eager expression. He sighed, took a cautious bite. "Chewy, smoky, vaguely sweet. It's actually not terrible." Her ears perked. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, grinning. "For a rubber boot?" She gasped in mock offense and swatted his arm with a spatula. "You're ungrateful." He laughed until he nearly dropped the plate, and she finally joined him, her tail sweeping wildly in amusement. Later that day, they ate together by the window, watching snow drift through the pines. It was almost exactly how they met. Two people, one meal, silence between them. But everything felt different now. "You remember the first time I ate here?" Vexa asked quietly, chewing on a piece of bread. "How could I forget? You looked like you were ready to bite my hand off." "I almost did," she said, a playful glint in her eyes. "I thought humans wanted something in return for food." Joranne smiled faintly. "I guess I just wanted company." She tilted her head. "And now?" He looked out the window, watching the snow catch light on its way down. "Now I think company is the only thing that's ever mattered." Vexa didn't say anything right away. She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Her fingers were still a little rough from years of work, but warm. "You give food," she murmured. "And I stay." "That you do?" he said softly. "Haven't gotten rid of you yet." "Never will," she said, smiling in that quiet, certain way that made it sound less like a promise and more like a truth written into the walls around them. That evening the wind returned, not fierce, just steady, brushing through the gaps in the boards and whispering like a familiar ghost. The fire burned low, and the world outside faded to silver. Vexa sat near the hearth, brushing the ends of her tail absently, while Joran read from an old book, the words soft and steady in the dim light. At some point, she interrupted him. "You read slow." "I savor the words," he said. "You fall asleep," she countered, smirking. He gave her a look over the book's edge. "And you talk too much." "Only because silence gets bored of itself," she said, and her smile gentled. Joran chuckled, closed the book, and stretched. "You always win these arguments. That's why you keep me." He stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the falling snow. "No," he said quietly. "I keep you because the world feels right when you're in it." Her ears flicked at that tail, pausing mid-motion. The fire crackled between them, warm and bright. She rose slowly, padded to his side, and leaned against him. "Then I guess I'm staying forever," she murmured. He glanced down, meeting her ember eyes. "Guess so." Sometime later, when the fire burned low and the snow piled high against the door, Joran found himself drifting half asleep in the chair. Vexa had curled nearby, tail draped lazily over his boots. Outside, the wind sang softly through the trees. No threat, no warning, just the quiet sound of a living world at peace. He thought about the first night again, a stranger in the rain, a half-eaten sandwich, a decision that seemed small at the time, but changed everything after. He reached down, brushing his fingers through the soft fur of her tail. "You still here, Vexa?" he whispered. Her voice came slow, drowsy, always. He smiled to himself, eyes closing. And somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the hush of snow against the window, the thought settled warm in his chest. That maybe this was all humanity ever needed to prove it belonged in the universe again. Not power, not conquest, not noise, just one kind act that refused to fade. He had offered her lunch. She had offered him a reason to stay, and now either could imagine a world without the other. If you enjoyed this quiet human story of connection and survival, don't forget to subscribe for more HFY sci-fi tales just like this one. Until next time, stay warm out there.